and is indeed an international spiritual monument which has become an epicenter for the struggle to protect what we call Miniwichoni, and everybody in their language has a name for the sacred water. In Western society, sometimes we can't say that water is sacred. We can say that, but sometimes it doesn't get through. So we might have to say something like, water is the foundation of all economic value the world over. Without water security, there is no food security. There is no energy security. And as a human species, we should seek to keep water for the common good and not have it privatized. And indeed, this is something that we are facing as original nations, as original peoples. And the, maybe at least 500-year conflict for indigenous peoples of this hemisphere, but even before that, we're talking 1,000-year conflict with dominion, with colonization, in an enemy that we should begin to name in 2017, not in terms of racializing who or what the enemy is or what that set of institutions is. But we can get to a little bit about that later. But when we talk about Standing Rock, we talk about all of these things. About water, about native nations, and indeed human beings, original creator-given authority to determine their own destiny, to create and be governed by the laws of creation, natural law and synthetic law as well, man-made law. We are talking about native nations, original and independent and prior sovereignty. In Canada, obviously I grew up in what is called the United States, and I'm an attorney. I went to law school, and in the United States we have something called, what is the equivalent of Aboriginal title in Canada, what's now called Canada. We have something called Indian title, and both of those concepts are unfounded and illegitimate intrusions into who we really are as original peoples. It's an attempted usurpation, a theft, a creative act on a part of the colonizer or the oppressor to frame the very mental archetype and foundation with which you can interpret your universe. This comes even from teaching us the English language as a first language. It's a method of absorption or assimilation or colonization. When we break the word colonization down, it indeed literally means to digest, as a colon digests. It's tricky, right?
Beautiful. The other end.
Yes, but it's for real. And in the beginning, and I did too, I thought of colonization in terms of Anglo or Christian European nation states committing genocide and a Holocaust and slavery the world over and against brown people and black people and non-Christian European people. And yes, that's true. That's part of the truth. That's part of our truth and our legacy that we must own. But the colonization that exists today in 2017 is a colonization that separates, it's an alienation. It separates human beings from their natural environment, their mind from their spirit. That's an academic and religious tradition that does that. And then it's also an economic worldview and practice that separates any, a true meaning from the labor that we do as human beings. And when we think about that, think about the assembly mind model versus a salmon people, or a horticultural civilization, a society, or a buffalo people that has a respect relationship with their food source and a direct relationship with their food source. And the colonization, and I'm not an expert in this. I'm just trying to navigate my way through this on this journey, just the same as you are. But that colonization, what I've learned from Standing Rock is that we have to build bridges. We can't think of this thing in terms of, this is what I think, or this is how I perceive the universe as a native person. It's got to be, this is how I perceive and able to maybe deconstruct and transcend the colonization that is in front of me. Indeed, sometimes I call it an assassination attempt on our original psyche, spiritual psyche. Because along with those separations, those alienations, we have things like the concept of currency, and which now fiat currency, which holds absolutely no value. And we have big finance, which is a derivation of that, and big extraction, carbon-based extraction. We have an economic reality that is propped up for us and imposed upon us, and which controls the very methods by which you are able to feed, clothe, provide energy, water security, and house yourselves. And we were sold this as progress, but it's values and actions of the institutions of law and policy and economics that are basically functioning for the benefit of the corporate state. And in Standing Rock, you can see how those arms and institutions of the nation state, which we are supposed to be able to trust to objectively administer justice and law and order. But in Standing Rock, over 700 people have now been arrested. The law enforcement agencies, the National Guard, which is a military department, the governor, and the state, or in Canada it would be the provincial legislature, and the media are all colluding to tell the story or create the narrative that they want to tell. And that narrative dehumanizes the tens of thousands of people who've come there to protect water. That narrative paints our people and the water protectors as unlawful, as violent, as unruly. and seeks to steal the moral and spiritual and indeed legal authority that we have to even stand there. Just like the original peoples of this territory have a spiritual, legal, and moral authority to protect their homelands against these intrusions, these incursions, this violence that's perpetrated by the corporate state. And we just have to own it, that we are an empire, that in our standard of living requires that we commit violence around the world, that we create institutions that effectively expropriate, to steal from the original peoples, who are the original owners, supreme title owners around the world. This is our story. This is our history as settlers, as original nations, and we don't have to hide from it. We don't have to sweep it under the rug. We don't have to avoid it. Because that's what I did all through my college years. That's all my professors did in law school. They didn't teach me everything that we needed to know. They just taught me what was in the book and what they tried to sugarcoat it. But at Standing Rock, not only do we have 700 arrests, but we have the collusions of all those sources that I talked about, and you have them lying to the public. On the video, you saw the water cannons, when the water cannons were brought out. I was there that night. And I was also there when they brought up those attack dogs. I don't know if you guys have ever seen video of those attack dogs. Just the optics, the imagery, harkens back to Christopher Columbus. And you have law enforcement agencies putting out statements to the local media denying and saying that they only used those water cannons to put out fires that protesters had started. You had the same law enforcement agency put out a statement that they did not use any form of explosives, and they used concussion grenades. Each time, including those two instances, and there's more, but those two instances are I need to mention them because a young lady almost lost her entire arm that night of those water cannons. And people's lives were negligently, intentionally put at risk. It's a felony called reckless endangerment, which the law enforcement agencies are charging water protectors with when they chain themselves to bulldozers. They're charging them with reckless endangerment because it puts somebody's life at risk, their own life, and presumably the law enforcement officer who has to cut them down. But then you have incidences like this water cannon that night, and you have them putting out statements to the local media that turn out to be complete lies, which are refuted by video evidence. And it's for these reasons that we have to, it's a different world. Like the day's over when you had to go to, what's the biggest broadcast? CBC, maybe? Is that the biggest, kind of the CNN of Canada? So 10 years ago, maybe 13 years ago, Facebook has been around for 13 years, you guys. But before that, you used to have to rely on it to create your content, to frame your narrative, and to get your story out to the world. Well, it's a completely different day now. And we have that responsibility to share each other's truths, to make sure that we are paying attention to each other and telling the world what's really important. Because right now there are civil rights violations, human rights violations, treaty violations going on at Standing Rock that most people don't really know about. And Standing Rock represents those things. And soon, Secwepemc or the Kamloops territory is going to represent those things. Those, a struggle for clean water, the struggle for Native nations to assert their international personality, which is our birthright, the struggle to protect, in the United States, it's the constitutional rights that every American should have. Indeed, it's the struggle for what does it really mean to be a patriot? Who decides what law and order is? Who decides what a patriot is? Who decides what a traitor is? And who decides what a terrorist is? And if you don't stand up, your government will decide who is a terrorist. And in fact, it already has. Is it Bill C-51? In Canada, in the United States, we have the same sort of laws that seek to criminalize any opposition that the corporate state senses to its agenda that it continues to perpetrate. And we just, I always like to say we need to get woke and we need to stay woke. Because right now, it might not seem that serious in Canada, or so-called Canada, because you don't have a Trump up here.
It's coming.
That's right, they may be coming. That's right, Trudeau is your Obama. They're nice, they look nice, they talk nice, and they're slick. At least with Trump, you get, there's no guile about Trump.
No brains either.
But what he represents is tyranny. Literal tyranny, like in real life. In 2017, where everybody in this room and all of your networks are going to have to look within to find where you draw the line. And where you have to make a determination to stand up, and where you may have to be a patriot. Who is a patriot? Who loves this land? Who loves this water? That's who a patriot is. They would have you believe that the patriot is the one who supports Kinder Morgan and the extraction, the expropriation of all of our collective mineral resources, which are then meant to be sold for corporate private benefit, sometimes to enemies of the settler state. That's who they would have you believe is the patriot. And they would have you believe that the traitor, that the terrorist is the human being willing to put their body, their life, their liberty, and their limbs in harm's way to protect those sacred resources, those national treasures, the true source of national security, for the benefit of all Canadians, all human beings, and all Americans. That's who they would have you believe is the traitor or the terrorist. And if we don't get woke and stay woke, most of you are going to believe it. And that's the nature of the battle for the soul of this entire hemisphere. And it's going on right now. And sometimes it's going to take people to stand up in that way. In the fight at Standing Rock, I was recently arrested with another woman who's here tonight. Her name's Vanessa Castle. and we were charged with felony inciting a riot just for being present and supporting a peaceful prayer camp, which was taking place on treaty territory and which was a deliberate move by another group of people to move to a higher ground. Now, we don't know what's coming next because the Army Corps of Engineers has announced that on February 22nd, that camp needs to be vacated. And then we have down there, it's called the Indian Reorganization Act. Councils, up here is probably called maybe the band councils, or the INAC governments, who, I mean, we can't really expect them to assert original, free, and independent sovereignty because sometimes they are literally creations of, and they derive their authority from settler state recognition, right? Sometimes other people have to stand up because they are put into, they're under a tremendous amount of pressure to provide for an impoverished people. People that were deliberately impoverished and upon whom a foreign poverty culture was imposed. Those values are not our values, but they're there, they're imposed. And sometimes those types of native governments can't act outside of their status as domestic, dependent nations. This is federal Indian law that derives from the doctrine of discovery, those terms, like domestic, dependent nationhood. Sometimes native nations or band councils can't act outside of